Composers use several tools to make video game music engaging and fitting a unique medium. Among them are adaptive music, which changes to respond to player decisions and in-game environments, and generative music, which is created in real time by a computer based on preset parameters. Many video games, including Celeste, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and most other games published in the last decade, use adaptive music to some degree, making it something of an industry standard. Generative music is much less common. Fewer titles, among them Spore and No Man's Sky, employ fully generative scores. Adaptive music is a tool fairly common for video game composers, and since its introduction into the world of game music, has been more and more commonly used in big-budget games. The autonomy, or adaptivity, of game music can serve as a measure of how adaptive a game's music system is. Music systems with no autonomy are considered reactive. Musical moments are the direct product of player decisions. Systems with high autonomy are considered linear, and their music is completely pre-written or predetermined. Even in generative scores with linear music systems, music is not impacted by gameplay. Systems that exist in the middle are considered adaptive. Where along the scale from reactive to linear a music system falls can have a strong impact on the feel of gameplay and of the musical experience of a game. Michael Camp argues in Musical Ecologies in Video Games that the music in a video game, whether diegetic or non-diegetic, has an impact on the game's ecology. Through the use of leitmotifs, cultural connotations, and style, music plays a role in shaping player perception and understanding of games, from indicating various states to a softer account of affordances. In James Gibson's Theories of Ecology, through which Camp analyzes the role of video game music, affordances are the learned or innate cues signaled to organisms through patterns or environmental features. According to Camp, non-diegetic music plays a special role in shaping affordances as various cues or tonal shifts cause players to understand what to do. For example, combat music sounds to signify to the player that they should be in a fighting state. Though Camp never mentions adaptive or generative music by name, they have an inseparable connection to many of the principles he describes. Without adaptivity in music, there would be no way of altering music to fit player or environmental changes, and the affordances learned by players on account of the musical changes would be lost to a profound degree. Specifically, adaptive and generative music can have the potential to be especially immersive. As demonstrated by the work of Patrick Hutchings and John McCormick, using an algorithmically generated score can result in a more immersed audience. In their study, Hutchings and McCormick used an algorithmic music system, AMS, that would associate musical patterns with in-game events. For example, a musical theme for the player's sword would be written, and, as a player interacts with it, employed and altered depending on the context in which it is used. Hutchings and McCormick tested their AMS by creating a generative music system for two different pre-existing games, Zelda Mystery of Solaris and StarCraft II. They conducted an experiment where players would be randomly assigned to either the game with the original score or the new AMS score. After playing, they were tested on immersion and association of musical terms to the in-game elements they represent. There was a definite positive trend between the use of the AMS and immersion. The players found it more difficult to associate the correct terms with the AMS themes when compared to the original score. As an early exploration of generative music for video games, this experiment holds up well, but the question of authorial intent is somewhat lost on Hutchings and McCormick's work. As they did not develop the games they used themselves, their scores weren't reflective of the creative intents of the authors. Music being so closely tied to a game's feel, and potentially story or playstyle, a disconnect from the original work or original creators would produce a less effective result in the score. There are several existing games whose authors chose for a generative score to be used, and their close connection to their product allows them to better flesh out generative music that fits with the game as a whole. In order to explore how a creator's vision manifests in the realm of adaptive music, one can explore and analyze pre-existing games whose use adaptive music as a core concept in the game's score. Many small creators, often bloggers or YouTube creators, make content about video game music. For example, YouTubers Scruffy, Game Music Fanfare, and 8-Bit Music Theory have channels dedicated to analyzing the music of video games, and adaptivity, being a core principle of video game composition, is touched on frequently. I intend to synthesize the musical analyses of these creators with my own, and with a compositional and technological understanding of adaptive music, to demonstrate how specific tools and strategies are used in various scenarios, and interpreting how the use of these tools impact the player and the work as a whole. When wandering the wilds of Hyrule, music that is much more complex or different than the gentle background piano may be heard in the distance. This may be the iconic melody of Kass's accordion, the stable theme, or one of Breath of the Wild's various town themes. The music is played softly and then dynamically increased or decreased in volume, a technique known as crossfading, so that it is sourced to a specific location. Players' curiosity is piqued by the music, and its physicality allows them to use it to navigate towards the mysterious sound. As they reach their destination, they hear the musical piece in full. This almost functions to blend the diegesis of the game's music. If I can explore the theme music for Kakariko Village and hear it fade in and out as I enter and leave, but there is no source for the music, does it exist in the universe of the game? Not only do the adaptive elements in Breath of the Wild soundtrack contribute to establishing affordances and giving players subtle instructions or cues on what they should do, but grounds the music as a part of the fantasy environment and, in doing so, grounds players in that environment as well. One specific instance of adaptive music in Breath of the Wild is the horizontal resequencing in the Molduga theme. When fighting the Molduga, the player hears this music. This part would cycle endlessly if the player merely chased the Molduga around, evading its attacks and making no progress in defeating it. If they knocked the beast out, however, they would be greeted by a drastic musical shift. This shift in music mirrors and celebrates the player's discovery. It also communicates to players that this is their chance to go and land as many attacks as possible. To return to the theory proposed by Michael Camp in Musical Ecologies in Video Games, we can see the role of this instance of the Breath of the Wild soundtrack plays in constructing the ecology of the player's gaming experience. Battle music playing around the Molduga affords to the player that they should be in a fighting state. Its driving repetition and intensity communicate that, in the environment of the battle, the player must be evading attacks and trying to incapacitate the Molduga. The musical transition when the beast is prone affords that a new state has been entered and that the monster may be approached and attacked. Other interpretations of Camp's theory on the Breath of the Wild soundtrack lead to some interesting revelations about the game music. For example, Camps writes, "Background music does not move between audio channels or increase and decrease in volume to correspond with the movement throughout the game world. Yet it has been explored that the background music for town and stable themes, each fitting the definition of non-diegetic, is sourced to a specific location and will fade in and out as one approaches, directly altering depending on the player's movement throughout the game world." Camp states, the player does not hear the music as a phenomenon that is out there to be looked for in the diegetic environment. This does not track for Breath of the Wild, where players may be, in many instances, drawn to the non-diegetic music with just as much curiosity as they would be the diegetic accordion tune of Kass the Rito. This contradiction in Camp's understanding of non-diegetic background music and that of a modern player experiencing Breath of the Wild may be attributed to the changes in technology that permit such unique instances of non-diegetic music. Open-world games call for very demanding technological development, and so too does their scoring, but it may also signal a gap in Camp's perception of game music. There are many instances of music that blend diegetic and non-diegetic qualities that aren't accurately described by Camp's proposal of transdiegetic music, or music that causes player action that impacts the in-game world. Overall, Breath of the Wild soundtrack serves to guide players as they navigate its large, open world, puzzles, and battles, using adaptivity to ground players in the experience, respond to players' achievements, and add character to the music. One repeated trend can be found in the adaptive construction of Celeste's score. For each stage, a unique theme plays that develops as a player reaches specific pivotal points. The music changes either vertically or horizontally, or a mix of both, to reflect how reaching that point changes the narrative or tone of the game. Most tracks in Celeste rank closer to the autonomous side of the adaptivity scale. Though the music grows and evolves with the player, it does so within very specifically defined parameters. The structure of each track can be written as various sections that repeat indefinitely or until a predetermined checkpoint is reached. One instance of this sectional adaptivity is in the track called Resurrections. 8-bit music theory analyzes this track from a compositional perspective, explaining how each of the 4 unique sections are based on the same 2 musical ideas. Each section has a specific musical quality that reflects the intensity of the game and the narrative that the stage serves to progress. Chapter 3 stage features a similar pattern of using adaptive music in line with a narrative. In this stage's score, called Scattered and Lost, however, the adaptivity is mainly through vertical remixing rather than horizontal resequencing. In other words, the musical element that changes in the Celestial Resort is the instrumentation, not the melody. The same song is repeated as the player explores the defunct resort, clearing clutter for its ghostly manager. After a milestone taking the form of obtaining various keys is reached, the melody stays the same, but new instruments are added, and by the end of the level, the player can hear the full score composed of the instrument parts they heard introduced. The gradually complexifying music of Scattered and Lost serves to make the player more and more anxious with each accomplishment. As they find keys and clear out the resort, they aren't encouraged to relax by the music. Instead, they become more on edge because of it. The music also mirrors the mental state of the resort manager, whose panic and worry drive the narrative of Chapter 3. Scattered and Lost rewards players' exploration with an achievement musically, and with the stage itself changing along with the music after each milestone is reached, players are kept engaged. This keeps the players grounded in what can be a labyrinthine level. Each musical change can be pinned to a specific moment in the game being reached. This is because the adaptivity in Celeste serves the narrative above anything else. Players are invited to follow protagonist Madeline's emotional journey through the music. When she's initially cautious and inquisitive at the beginning of the old site in Chapter 2, the player feels the exact same curiosity because of the music. When she experiences a panic attack and has to calm herself down, so too do the players need to recover with the music from an intense dramatic section and its adaptive settling into calmness. The music mimics Madeline's emotions, the core of Celeste's emotion-driven plot, and draws players into her internal world. A game far on the adaptive side of the scale is Untitled Goose Game. This game's soundtrack is so responsive to player action that it might even be classified as reactive, meaning that the music is crafted by its reaction to the player. Thanks to an interview with the developers and sound engineer M. Halberstadt, insight can be gained on the process for developing the soundscape of Untitled Goose Game. Halberstadt recorded all sounds heard in the game in-house and edited them to make the player's honk the loudest and most important sound. Untitled Goose Game also features some instances of diegetic music. Speakers and radios play music and can be carried around by players. While the player's action of moving it may alter the sound, for example, putting a radio underwater would dampen the sound, it is not an instance of adaptive music because the song playing doesn't change. Instead, it can be classified as procedural or adaptive audio. After deciding to integrate adaptive music into Untitled Goose Game, Dan Golding and House House worked to design a score that could adapt to the mischief and chaos of their game. Golding wrote a high-energy and low-energy version of Debussy's Preludes and programmed them to play corresponding to the circumstance of the game, creating a branching form of horizontal resequencing. Branching is when a piece transitioned section to section at the end of each musical phrase. The music evolves by branching off into different sections with different melodies, rhythm, tempo, or other musical elements. This specific tool can be difficult because changes can happen more rapidly than the pre-written musical phrases can play through and transition, leaving a game action scored with unfitting music. To solve this, Golding split the music into smaller chunks of about 2 individual beats, so that the game music engine could switch from a phrase to a phrase quicker, with greater accuracy to the events of the game, and with more overall adaptivity. In the finished product, Untitled Goose Game has a score that is incredibly reactive and playful. When being confronted for your chaotic ruse crimes by a shopkeeper, this music plays. It will only subside when you leave the shopkeeper alone. Managing to take a gardener's carrots from right under his nose and fleeing will see the background music break out into this piece. Sometimes, when the player hasn't caused any change in the environment or the NPCs, they'll be faced by this. Silence. Since the score reacts to player action with music, it also responds to player inaction with silence. Interweaving music with gameplay in this manner allows for players to identify patterns and become aware of how their actions as a goose impact the game. Most importantly, it gives a playful, silly game a playful, silly score. Music has the power to play a large role in the creative effect of any work of media, and the value of music in video games is multi-layered. Music can drive emotional and story beats, as it does in film and TV, but can also have a functional importance by communicating ideas to players that help them navigate game environments, or by being a gameplay mechanic in and of itself. Adaptivity allows game music to fit its medium. Its changes can guide players to new destinations, give warnings, create a growing and developing emotional story, help with world building, and more. Contrasting modern game music with a single repeating line of arcade games in the past can show you just how much video game and audio technology have developed in the past 60 years alone. In terms of video games specifically, adaptivity is the most important technological development to letting music fit its medium. Hopefully, a greater public understanding of what adaptive music is and what it does will lead to a greater appreciation of such an impactful art.